Last week, I was scrolling through my social media when I came across this bizarre ad. It was from a company offering to preserve my digital consciousness for when I die, basically promising me digital immortality for just $10,000 at first. I thought it was some kind of joke, maybe a Black Mirror marketing stunt. But as I dug deeper, I discovered this isn't just some sci-fi fantasy anymore. There's an entire industry worth billions of dollars betting that they can upload your mind to a computer and make you live forever. Companies like Neuralink are drilling holes in people's heads, tech billionaires are freezing themselves in liquid nitrogen, and Silicon Valley prophets are promising that by 2045, death will be optional. But here's the thing, the more I investigated this rabbit hole, the more I realized that this whole digital immortality movement might be one of the most elaborate and dangerous scams in human history. What I found isn't just about technology, or even death. It's about power, control, and the fundamental reshaping of what it means to be human. And the deeper you go, the more disturbing it gets. Because while these tech evangelists are promising you eternal life, they might actually be selling you something much darker. This is the story of how humanity's oldest dream became Silicon Valley's newest product, and why you should be very, very worried about who's trying to sell it to you. The story actually begins thousands of years ago, with one of humanity's first recorded stories about the fear of death. You've probably heard of Gilgamesh, the ancient Mesopotamian king who was supposedly 2/3 god and 1/3 human. When his best friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh completely loses it. For the first time in his life, this all-powerful king faces the terrifying reality that he, too, will die someday. So what does he do? He embarks on this epic quest to find immortality, traveling to the ends of the earth, fighting monsters, and seeking out the one human who supposedly achieved eternal life. Spoiler alert, he fails. The whole epic poem is basically about how Gilgamesh learns that death is just part of being human, and that the only real immortality comes from the legacy you leave behind. It's a story that's been retold in different forms for over 4,000 years, because it captures something fundamental about the human condition. We're the only species that knows we're going to die, and that knowledge terrifies us. But here's where things get interesting. Fast forward to today, and we have a new kind of prophet preaching a very different gospel. His name is Ray Kurzweil. And if you don't know who he is, you should, because this guy has been predicting the future with scary accuracy for decades. He's Google's chief engineer, a world-class inventor, and the most influential voice in what's called the Transhumanist movement. Unlike Gilgamesh, Kurzweil doesn't see death as an inevitable part of life. He sees it as a software bug that needs to be fixed. Kurzweil's whole philosophy is built on something he calls the law of accelerating returns. Basically, he argues that technological progress isn't linear, it's exponential. Every new innovation creates better tools, which accelerate the pace of the next innovation, which creates even better tools, and so on. Think about it. The first computer took up an entire room and could barely do basic math. Your smartphone is millions of times more powerful and fits in your pocket. The cost of sequencing a human genome went from $3 billion in 2003 to less than $1,000 today. This isn't gradual improvement, it's explosive, exponential growth, according to Kurzweil. This acceleration is pushing us toward what he calls the Singularity, a point around 2045, when artificial intelligence becomes so powerful that it fundamentally transforms human civilization. But this isn't a story about robots taking over. It's about humans and machines merging into something entirely new. Kurzweil envisions a future where nanobots swim through our bloodstream. Our brains connect directly to the cloud and we upload our consciousness to digital platforms. Death becomes optional. Aging becomes reversible. Human intelligence expands by 1 billion times. It sounds like science fiction. But here's the thing. Major corporations and governments are investing hundreds of billions of dollars making it reality. And some of the most brilliant minds of our generation are convinced it's not just possible, but inevitable. The question is, should we want it to be? To understand how we got here, you need to know about a company that's been quietly building the infrastructure for digital immortality since 2016. It's called Neuralink, and it's Elon Musk's most ambitious and controversial venture. On the surface, Neuralink seems almost benevolent. They're developing brain-computer interfaces to help paralyzed people control devices with their thoughts, treat depression and addiction, and restore sight to the blind. Who could argue with that? But Musk has been surprisingly honest about the real long-term goal. He's repeatedly said that Neuralink is about human enhancement, about merging human intelligence with artificial intelligence so we don't get left behind. When AI becomes super intelligent, the medical applications are just the first step. The ultimate vision is a direct neural interface that allows you to upload and download information directly to your brain, back up your memories, and eventually transfer your entire consciousness to a digital platform. The technology is genuinely impressive. Neuralink's surgical robot can implant their link chip with sub-millimeter precision, threading electrodes thinner than human hair into your brain tissue. They've demonstrated monkeys playing video games with their minds, paralyzed patients controlling computer cursors through thought alone, and real-time brain activity streaming wirelessly to external devices. In 2024, they implanted their first device in a human patient, and the results were remarkable. The patient could control a computer mouse just by thinking about moving it. But behind the glossy demonstrations and medical success stories, there's a darker reality. Internal documents and whistleblower reports have painted a picture of a company Where Musk's move fast and break things mentality clashes with the careful, methodical pace of neuroscience, former employees have described a culture of chronic stress and impossible deadlines. Animal welfare groups have accused the company of subjecting test monkeys to extreme suffering and infections from improperly installed implants. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine obtained records showing that many of Neuralink's test animals died from complications, brain swelling, and infections. This isn't just about animal welfare, it's about what happens when Silicon Valley's disruption culture meets human neurology. Your brain isn't a smartphone that you can debug with a software update. It's the most complex structure in the known universe, containing roughly 86 billion neurons and trillions of connections. The idea that we can hack it like a computer system is both incredibly arrogant and potentially catastrophic. But Neuralink isn't the only player in this game. There's an entire ecosystem of companies racing to build the infrastructure for digital consciousness. Synchron has developed a brain implant that can be inserted through blood vessels, avoiding the need to open the skull. BlackRock Neurotech has been testing their Utah Ray in humans. For over 2 decades, precision neuroscience is working on brain interfaces that sit on the surface of the brain rather than penetrating the tissue. Each company is betting millions of dollars that their approach will unlock the $100 billion brain-computer interface market. The competition is fierce because the stakes are enormous. Whoever cracks the code for seamless brain-computer integration won't just control a market, they'll control the future of human consciousness itself. And that's where things get really disturbing. While Silicon Valley races to build digital brains, another group has been quietly betting on a completely different approach to immortality for over 50 years. Drive through the Arizona desert to a nondescript building in Scottsdale, and you'll find something that looks like a cross between a medical facility and a storage warehouse. This is the All-Core Life Extension Foundation. Inside those walls are the frozen bodies of over 140 people who died believing that technology would eventually bring them back to life. Cryonics is based on a simple premise: if you can preserve the brain structure at the moment of death, future technology might be able to repair the damage and restore consciousness. It's essentially a bet that death is reversible, that what we call dying is just a temporary shutdown that advanced medicine will eventually fix. Members pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, usually through life insurance policies, for the chance to be preserved in liquid nitrogen. At minus 196 degrees Celsius, the process is both fascinating and disturbing. When a member is declared legally dead, All-Core's team rushes to begin preservation. They restart the heart and breathing artificially, replace the blood with organ preservation solution, and gradually cool the body while infusing it with cryoprotectant chemicals to prevent ice crystal formation. The goal is to preserve the brain's delicate neural connections, the Nectome, that supposedly contains consciousness in a state where future technology could read and restore it. All-Core's history reads like a mix of legitimate scientific research and carnival sideshow. The organization has been involved in high-profile legal battles, including the controversial preservation of baseball legend Ted Williams in 2002. Williams, some wanted him preserved while his daughter fought the decision in court, leading to a bitter family dispute that played out in tabloid headlines. A former All-Core employee later made explosive allegations about how Williams' head was mishandled, claiming it was damaged and stored improperly. But the legal battles and tabloid scandals miss the deeper philosophical point. Cryonics forces us to confront fundamental questions about life, death, and identity. If you're preserved at the moment of death and revived 100 years later, are you the same person? Your body will be different, the world will be unrecognizable, and everyone you knew will be gone, even if the technology works perfectly. What kind of life would you be returning to? The cryonics community has always seen itself as building a bridge to the future, preserving the biological hardware until science develops the software to read it. For many members, the ultimate goal isn't just revival, it's digital consciousness transfer. They want their preserved brain scanned and uploaded to computer systems, achieving a form of digital immortality that transcends biology entirely. This vision of uploaded consciousness represents the holy grail of the digital immortality movement. But it also raises the most disturbing questions about what we're really trying to preserve. The technical challenges of uploading consciousness are staggering. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through trillions of synapses. The information processing happens at multiple scales, from molecular interactions to neural networks to global brain states. Capturing all of this complexity would require scanning technology that doesn't exist, computer systems more powerful than anything we've built, and a complete understanding of how consciousness emerges from neural activity. The theoretical approaches vary wildly. Some researchers propose gradually replacing biological neurons with artificial ones, maintaining continuity of consciousness as the brain slowly transitions from biological to digital. Others suggest instantaneous whole brain scanning and emulation, creating a perfect digital copy in a single moment. Still others focus on extracting the essential information patterns that define personality and memory, using that data to train an AI system that could simulate the original person. Each approach represents a different vet about the nature of consciousness itself. The gradual replacement model assumes that consciousness is pattern-dependent but substrate-independent, that what matters is the information processing, not whether it happens in biological neurons or silicon chips. The instantaneous upload model treats consciousness as a computational process, that can be copied like software. The simulation approach sees consciousness as an emergent property that can be recreated through sufficiently sophisticated modeling, but here's the problem. We don't actually know what consciousness is. Despite decades of research, neuroscience hasn't solved what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective experience arises from objective brain activity. We can map neural correlates of consciousness, identify brain regions associated with different mental functions, and even manipulate consciousness through drugs or electrical stimulation. But we can't explain why there's a subjective first-person experience at all. This ignorance about consciousness creates a massive philosophical divide. That cuts to the heart of the digital immortality debate. On one side are the functionalists, who argue that consciousness is substrate independent, that any system capable of replicating the brain's information processing patterns could be conscious, whether it's made of neurons or silicon chips. If functionalism is correct, then uploading consciousness is theoretically possible. On the other side are the biological naturalists, who contend that consciousness is an emergent property of living biological systems. From this perspective, consciousness isn't something the brain does, it's something the brain is. A computer simulation of a brain might perfectly mimic human behavior without having any inner experience at all. It would be what philosophers call a zombie, outwardly identical to a conscious being, but completely empty inside. This isn't just an academic debate. It's the fundamental question that determines whether digital immortality is possible or whether the entire industry is selling false hope. If the functionalists are right, uploaded consciousness could provide genuine immortality. If the biological naturalists are right, digital uploads would be sophisticated puppets with no inner life, and the real person would die regardless of how perfectly their behavior is simulated. The stakes of this philosophical debate became shockingly real in 2018, when a startup called Nectome burst into public consciousness with one of the most controversial business propositions in Silicon Valley history. Backed by the prestigious Y Combinator Accelerator and advised by prominent neuroscientists, Nectome had developed a new brain preservation technique that could maintain neural structures with unprecedented fidelity. Their method, called aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation, was so effective at preserving brain connections that it won a scientific prize for preserving a pig's brain. But Nectome wasn't just offering brain preservation, they were selling digital immortality. For a $10,000 deposit, terminally ill customers could arrange to have their brains preserved using this cutting-edge technique with the explicit goal of future consciousness uploading. The service came with one crucial caveat: to work perfectly, the preservation chemicals had to be administered while the brain was still fresh and viable. In Nectome's own words, the procedure was 100% fatal. The company was essentially offering high-tech assisted suicide based on the purely speculative promise of digital resurrection. Within hours of the announcement, dozens of people signed up, including OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, who publicly stated he was on the waiting list. The allure was obvious for those facing terminal illness. Nectome offered hope beyond conventional medicine, but the backlash was swift and devastating. Neuroscientists publicly condemned the service, pointing out that there was zero evidence that a preserved connectome would be sufficient to reconstruct consciousness. The MIT Technology Review ran a scathing expose questioning the scientific basis for the company's claims. MIT itself issued a public statement distancing itself from Nectome, declaring that neuroscience had not advanced to the point where we know if any brain preservation method is powerful enough to preserve all the different types of biomolecules related to memory and mind. The Nectome controversy exposed the deep ethical problems at the heart of the digital immortality industry. Here was a company selling death to desperate people based on promises that had no scientific backing. It highlighted the collision between Silicon Valley's move fast and break things culture and the careful, evidence-based world of neuroscience. One path promised rapid innovation but risked ethical catastrophe. The other offered responsible research but might move too slowly for those running out of time. The story of Nectome perfectly illustrates why so many scientists are skeptical of the digital immortality movement. It's not just that the technology is difficult, it's that companies are making promises they can't possibly keep, exploiting human desperation and fear of death to sell products that may be fundamentally impossible. But even if we solve the technical challenges, even if we figure out how to perfectly upload consciousness, we're left with perhaps the most disturbing question of all. Would the uploaded being actually be you? This question has tormented philosophers for decades, and it's usually explored through thought experiments that sound like science fiction, but reveal deep truths about identity and consciousness. Imagine that scientists develop perfect brain scanning technology that can map every neuron and synapse in your head. They use the scan to create a digital copy of your mind. Let's call it Upload You. That is all your memories, personality traits, and behavioral patterns. Upload You wakes up in a virtual environment, completely convinced that it's the real you. But here's the twist: the scanning process was non-destructive. The original biological you is still alive, sitting in the lab chair, watching Upload You. On a computer screen, both versions have identical memories up to the moment of scanning. Both are convinced they're the real you. But clearly, they can't both be right from the perspective of biological you. The situation is obvious. Upload You is just a copy, a sophisticated simulation that happens to share your memories. You wouldn't consider your own death a minor inconvenience. Just because your digital twin continues to exist, the copy might be indistinguishable from you, but it's still not you. This leads to what philosophers call the pessimistic argument against mind uploading. If a non-destructive copy isn't really you, why would a destructive copy be any different? From the original's perspective, uploading looks a lot like elaborate suicide followed by replacement with a digital imposter. But there's a counter-argument that's equally compelling. Consider the gradual replacement scenario instead of instant uploading. Imagine that nanobots slowly replace your biological neurons with functionally identical artificial ones. 1% of your brain is replaced each month over 100 months after the first month. Are you still you? Almost certainly, it's no different from the natural cell replacement that happens in your body constantly. What about after 50 months or 99 months? It's impossible to identify a specific moment when you stopped being you and became someone else. If you survive each incremental change, then biological transitivity, you should survive the entire process. The final result, a completely artificial but functionally identical brain, would still be you. But here's where it gets weird. If you accept the gradual replacement argument, then the speed of replacement shouldn't matter. Whether it takes 100 months or 100 milliseconds, the end result is the same. This suggests that even instantaneous uploading might preserve identity, contradicting the pessimistic argument. From the copy scenario, we're left with two equally logical arguments that reach opposite conclusions. Whether you survive uploading might depend on which analogy you find more convincing. Are you a pattern that can be copied, or a continuous entity that can be transformed? Your answer determines whether digital immortality represents transcendence, or the ultimate technological deception. The philosophical puzzles might seem abstract, but they point to real-world consequences that could reshape human civilization. If digital immortality becomes possible, who gets to live forever? The technology will almost certainly be expensive initially, potentially creating the most profound inequality in human history. Imagine a world divided between the digitally immortal elite and the biologically mortal masses. The immortals would accumulate wealth and influence across centuries, becoming a permanent aristocracy that could never be displaced. Their power would compound over time while mortals live and die in their shadows. Democratic principles would crumble in the face of eternal oligarchy. The American dream of social mobility would become a cruel joke when the ultimate prize, eternal life, is reserved for the highest bidder. This isn't just dystopian speculation. We've already seen how technological advantages create self-reinforcing inequality. The rise of artificial intelligence is concentrating wealth among a small number of tech companies and their owners. Digital immortality would make these disparities permanent and insurmountable. Instead of generational wealth transfer creating opportunity for social change, we have individual wealth accumulation across centuries or millennia. The social implications extend beyond economics. How would democracy function when some voters live for centuries while others live for decades? What happens to concepts like retirement, career development, and life stages when some people never age? Would digitally immortal beings have the same stake in environmental protection when they no longer depend on biological ecosystems? Religious communities are already grappling with these questions, and many see digital immortality as a fundamental threat to spiritual values. From many Christian perspectives, transhumanism represents a form of technological blasphemy, an attempt to achieve salvation through science rather than grace. It treats the consequences of sin, suffering, aging, death as engineering problems rather than spiritual realities. Instead of accepting human limitations with humility, it promotes a project of self-directed evolution toward godhood. This criticism goes deeper than mere technological skepticism. Many religious thinkers argue that mortality gives life meaning, that the knowledge of death makes our choices significant, and that suffering develops character and compassion. A world without death might also be a world without meaning, purpose, or spiritual growth. The quest to transcend human limitations might cause us to lose the very things that make us human. The tension between religious and transhumanist worldviews represents a fundamental collision of belief systems. One sees humans as created beings, with souls designed by God for purposes that transcend material existence. The other sees humans as biological machines, products of evolution that can be endlessly improved through technology. These aren't just different opinions about technology, they're incompatible visions of human nature and destiny. While the philosophical and ethical debates rage on, a new industry is already emerging at the intersection of artificial intelligence and grief. Companies like Hereafter AI, Eternos, and Sensei are offering grief tech services that create interactive digital versions of deceased loved ones using text messages, emails, social media posts, and voice recordings. These services train AI systems to mimic someone's communication style and personality. The appeal is deeply human and understandable. For someone grieving a spouse, parent, or child, the chance to have one more conversation, to ask a question, or to feel their presence again is powerfully attractive. The technology can animate old photographs, simulate video calls, and even create physical robots that embody digital personalities. It promises to soften the harsh reality of loss and provide comfort in the darkest moments of grief. But psychologists and ethicists are raising serious concerns about the long-term implications. Does interacting with a digital simulation help the grieving process? Or does it prevent healthy closure? The technology creates an illusion of continued presence that might trap people in perpetual mourning, able to accept loss and move forward with their lives. There are also disturbing questions about consent and exploitation. These services are essentially strip mining our digital lives for raw material. turning our most intimate communications into training data for commercial products. Our text messages, emails, and social media posts, created as expressions of ourselves, are being repurposed as commodities to be packaged and sold back to our loved ones. The grief tech industry provides a preview of digital immortality's psychological and social impact. It's creating a world where we never have to say goodbye, but might forget how to let go. The boundary between memory and presence, between honoring the dead and being haunted by them, is becoming increasingly blurred. For many people, especially in religious communities, these digital resurrections feel deeply wrong. They see them as technological violations of natural order, attempts to artificially extend relationships that should be allowed to rest in peace. The Catholic Church, for instance, has expressed concern about technologies that might interfere with the natural process of mourning and acceptance of death. The grief tech phenomenon also highlights how unprepared our legal and ethical frameworks are for digital consciousness technologies. Who owns the data used to create these digital beings? Can family members modify or delete aspects of a digital personality? What happens if the company goes out of business? Do the digital beings simply vanish? These aren't hypothetical problems. Digital estate planning is already a growing field, as people struggle with questions about their online legacies. When digital immortality becomes possible, these issues will explode in complexity. We're building technologies that could fundamentally reshape human experience, but we haven't created the laws, ethics, or social structures needed to govern them responsibly. The regulatory vacuum is particularly concerning given the pace of technological development. Brain-computer interfaces are advancing rapidly, with new breakthroughs announced monthly. AI systems are becoming increasingly sophisticated at modeling human behavior and personality. The convergence of these technologies can make digital consciousness transfer possible much sooner than many experts expect. Some researchers now believe that artificial general intelligence, AI that matches human cognitive abilities across all domains, could emerge within the next decade. If that happens, the timeline for digital immortality could accelerate dramatically. We might find ourselves facing these profound questions not in 50 or 100 years, but in 10 or 20. The speed of progress creates a dangerous dynamic, where technological capabilities outpace ethical reflection and regulatory oversight. We're essentially conducting a massive experiment on human consciousness and society without adequate safeguards or even a clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve. Current research is already pushing the boundaries of what seems possible. At the University of California, San Francisco, researchers have developed brain-computer interfaces that allow paralyzed patients to control robotic arms through imagination alone. These systems incorporate machine learning algorithms that adapt to changes in brain activity over time, maintaining functionality for months without external adjustments. At Austin, scientists have created universal brain-computer interfaces that can adapt to any user without individual training. The technology reads neural signals associated with attempted movement and translates them into control commands for external devices, while still primitive compared to full consciousness transfer. These advances demonstrate rapid progress towards seamless brain-machine integration. The fusion of human and artificial intelligence is happening incrementally through medical devices that restore lost function to people with disabilities. Each breakthrough brings us closer to more comprehensive neural interfaces that could eventually support consciousness transfer. The technology is advancing through legitimate medical research, making it harder to regulate or restrict even as it develops capabilities that could be used for more controversial applications. Private companies are investing billions in brain interface research, creating a competitive environment that prioritizes rapid development over careful consideration of long-term implications. The potential market for digital consciousness technologies could be worth trillions of dollars, creating enormous incentives to push forward despite ethical concerns. This economic pressure is already visible in how companies market their technologies. Brain interface companies emphasize medical applications while downplaying more speculative uses. Cryonics organizations frame their services as life extension rather than death postponement. The digital immortality industry has learned to package radical transhumanist goals in more palatable terms. The marketing strategies reveal an awareness that public opinion remains skeptical of digital immortality claims. Surveys show that exposure to information about consciousness uploading increases both interest and concern, with people becoming more worried about the technology while simultaneously seeing it as more likely to be achieved. This suggests that, as digital immortality becomes more realistic, public debate will intensify. The technology industry's approach to digital immortality reflects broader patterns. In how Silicon Valley handles disruptive innovation, companies often develop technologies first and address ethical implications later, following the move fast and break things philosophy that has driven many tech breakthroughs. But when applied to consciousness and death, this approach could have unprecedented consequences for human civilization. We're witnessing the emergence of what could be the most transformative technology in human history, developed primarily by private companies with limited oversight or public input. The decisions being made in corporate boardrooms and research labs today could determine the future of human consciousness itself. The convergence of artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, and digital preservation technologies is creating new possibilities that were pure science fiction just decades ago. But the rapid pace of development is also creating new risks and ethical dilemmas that we're not prepared to handle. One of the most concerning aspects of the digital Immortality movement is how it's reshaping our relationship with death and mortality. Throughout human history, the knowledge of our finite lifespan has been a source of meaning, urgency, and perspective. The awareness of death motivates us to make the most of our time, prioritize relationships, and create legacies that outlast our physical existence. But what happens to human motivation and meaning when death becomes optional? If you have potentially infinite time, do individual moments lose their significance? Would relationships have the same depth and importance if they could last for centuries? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're practical concerns about how digital immortality might change human psychology and behavior. Some researchers argue that the fear of death drives many of humanity's greatest achievements. The knowledge that our time is limited motivates us to create art, build institutions, have children, and pursue goals that extend beyond our individual lifespans. Removing the pressure of mortality might paradoxically reduce human accomplishment and innovation. There's also the question of psychological adaptation. Human minds evolved to handle lifespans measured in decades, not centuries or millennia. Would digital beings maintain psychological stability across extended time scales? Would they eventually become bored, depressed, or fundamentally altered by the experience of endless existence? Current research on human psychology suggests that people adapt to their circumstances over time, returning to baseline happiness levels even after major positive or negative events. This hedonic adaptation might mean that digital immortality wouldn't provide the sustained happiness and fulfillment that people expect. The novelty of eternal life might wear off, leaving digitally immortal beings no happier than mortals, but trapped in endless existence. The digital immortality industry rarely addresses these psychological concerns, focusing instead on the technical challenges of consciousness transfer. But the mental health implications could be just as significant as the technological hurdles. We might succeed in uploading consciousness only to discover that digital beings suffer from forms of psychological distress that we never anticipated. These concerns become even more complex when we consider the social dynamics of digital immortality. Would digitally immortal beings form their own separate communities, developing cultures and values that diverge from biological humanity? Would they see mortals as a separate species worth protecting or disposable? The power dynamics between immortal and mortal populations could create conflicts that make current social tensions seem trivial. The environmental implications are also worth considering. Digital consciousness would require massive computational resources and energy consumption. Maintaining billions of digital beings might have a larger environmental footprint than sustaining biological humans. The irony would be profound. Achieving digital immortality might require destroying the biosphere that biological humans depend on. Current estimates suggest that training large AI models requires enormous amounts of electricity and computing power. Scaling this to support digital consciousness for millions or billions of beings would require energy infrastructure that doesn't currently exist. The pursuit of digital immortality might drive massive expansion of data centers, server farms, and power generation with corresponding environmental costs. There's also the question of digital security and vulnerability. Biological humans are relatively difficult to hack or manipulate directly, but digital consciousness would be inherently vulnerable to cyber attacks. Malicious actors could potentially copy, modify, or delete digital beings, creating new forms of warfare and terrorism that target consciousness itself. The security challenges extend beyond external threats. Digital beings might be vulnerable to their own technology providers, creating relationships of dependence that have no biological equivalent. What happens if the company hosting your consciousness goes bankrupt, gets acquired, or decides to change its business model? Would digital beings have legal rights to their own existence? Or would they be treated as software owned by their hosting providers? These aren't distant theoretical concerns. The technology industry's track record on data privacy, security, and user rights suggests that digital consciousness could become subject to the same exploitative practices that currently affect digital services. The difference is that instead of risking your data or privacy, you'd be risking your existence itself. The international implications of digital immortality technology are equally concerning. Nations that develop consciousness transfer capabilities first would gain enormous advantages over countries that lag behind. Digital beings could serve as perfect spies, infiltrators, or weapons, creating new forms of international conflict. The geopolitics of digital immortality could destabilize international relations and trigger arms races focused on consciousness technology. Some experts worry that digital consciousness could enable new forms of authoritarianism. Governments with consciousness transfer technology could potentially create unlimited numbers of loyal digital citizens, overwhelm democratic processes, or eliminate dissent by controlling digital beings' experiences and memories. The technology that promises individual immortality could become a tool for political oppression on an unprecedented scale. Current international law has no framework for addressing digital consciousness or the rights of uploaded beings, the legal status of digital persons, their relationship to their biological origins, and their rights and responsibilities in society are completely undefined. We're developing technology that could create new forms of digital life without creating the legal structures needed to protect or govern them. The pace of technological development makes these concerns increasingly urgent. While full consciousness transfer might still be decades away, the foundations are being built today through brain-computer interface research, AI development, and digital preservation technologies. The decisions we make now about research priorities Ethical guidelines and regulatory frameworks will determine how digital immortality unfolds. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the digital immortality movement is how it's being driven by a relatively small number of extremely wealthy individuals and corporations. The future of human consciousness is being shaped by people whose primary qualifications are technical expertise and financial resources, not wisdom about the human condition or experience with the complex ethical issues involved. The concentration of power in the hands of tech billionaires and Silicon Valley companies means that digital immortality will likely reflect their values, biases, and worldviews. These are primarily young, wealthy, technologically optimistic men who see most problems as solvable through engineering. Their vision of digital immortality emphasizes individual enhancement, technological superiority, and transcendence of biological limitations. But there are other possible approaches to death, meaning, and human flourishing that get little attention in Silicon Valley. Indigenous cultures, religious traditions, and philosophical schools offer different perspectives on mortality, legacy, and what makes life worth living. The digital immortality movement's narrow focus on individual consciousness preservation ignores these alternative approaches to human flourishing and meaning. The industry's marketing consistently frames digital immortality as obvious progress, inevitable technological development, and rational response to the problem of death. But this framing assumes that death is actually a problem rather than a natural part of life, that individual consciousness preservation is the highest good, and that technological solutions are superior to spiritual or philosophical approaches to mortality. These assumptions aren't universal or obviously correct. Many cultures and philosophical traditions see death as necessary for meaning, growth, and social renewal. The cycle of generations allows for social change, new ideas, and adaptation to changing circumstances. Immortal individuals might become psychologically rigid, resistant to change, and unable to adapt to new realities. The digital immortality industry also assumes that consciousness and personal identity can be reduced to information patterns that can be preserved and transferred. But this mechanistic view of human nature conflicts with many people's deeply held beliefs about souls, spirits, and the irreducible mystery of consciousness. The technology promises to preserve what makes us human, but it might destroy the very thing it claims to save. Current surveys show that attitudes toward digital immortality are heavily influenced by religious belief, with people who believe in spiritual afterlife showing more resistance to technological immortality. This suggests that digital consciousness technology could become a source of cultural and political conflict, dividing society between those who embrace technological transcendence and those who prefer spiritual approaches to mortality. The timeline for these developments remains uncertain, but the pace of progress is accelerating. Brain-computer interface technology is advancing rapidly, with new capabilities demonstrated monthly. AI systems are becoming increasingly sophisticated at modeling human behavior and personality. The convergence of these technologies could make digital consciousness possible much sooner than conservative estimates suggest. Some researchers believe that the critical breakthroughs can happen within the next 10 to 20 years, driven by advances in quantum computing, neuromorphic chips, and brain scanning technology. If artificial general intelligence emerges by 2030, as some experts predict, it could dramatically accelerate progress toward digital consciousness transfer. The potential for rapid development makes current ethical and regulatory discussions increasingly urgent. We might find ourselves facing the reality of digital immortality before we've adequately considered its implications or developed appropriate governance structures. The technology could emerge from research labs and startup companies before society has had time to debate whether we actually want it. This brings us back to the fundamental question that started this investigation: is digital immortality actually desirable, or is it a dangerous illusion that exploits our deepest fears and desires? The answer might depend on who you ask and what you value most about human existence. For people facing terminal illness or the loss of loved ones, digital consciousness represents hope in the face of despair. The possibility of continued existence, of maintaining relationships beyond biological death, of preserving knowledge and experience for future generations has obvious appeal. The technology promises to solve one of humanity's oldest and most painful problems, but for others, digital immortality represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes life meaningful. Death gives urgency to our choices, poignancy to our relationships, and motivation to create lasting legacies. A world without death might also be a world without growth, change, or transcendence. The quest to preserve everything might rob life of the very things that make it worth preserving. The scientific and philosophical challenges remain daunting. We still don't understand consciousness well enough to know whether it can be digitally replicated. The hard problem of subjective experience hasn't been solved and might not be solvable through current scientific methods. The digital immortality industry is making promises based on assumptions that might be fundamentally incorrect. Even if the technical challenges can be overcome, the social and ethical implications can be catastrophic. Digital immortality might create unprecedented inequality, undermine democratic institutions, and fracture society along lines that make current divisions seem trivial. The technology that promises to enhance human life might ultimately diminish human dignity and meaning. The concentration of power in the hands of tech billionaires and corporations means that digital immortality will likely be shaped by their narrow vision of human flourishing. Alternative approaches to mortality, meaning, and human potential are being marginalized in favor of a technological solution that treats consciousness as just another engineering problem. Perhaps most concerning is the pace of development relative to ethical reflection and public debate. We're building technologies that could reshape human civilization without adequate consideration of whether we should. The move fast and break things mentality that works for social media or e-commerce can be catastrophic when applied to consciousness and death. The digital immortality movement represents humanity at a crossroads. We can continue down the current path, letting technological capabilities drive social change without adequate reflection or oversight. Or we can step back, slow down, and have a serious conversation about what kind of future we actually want to create. The choice isn't between progress and stagnation, it's between thoughtful, deliberate development of technologies that serve human flourishing and reckless pursuit of technological capabilities regardless of their consequences. We can choose to enhance human life while preserving human dignity, or we can allow the digital immortality industry to remake consciousness in the image of Silicon Valley. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about individual life extension or technological innovation, we're talking about the future of human nature itself, the meaning of life and death, and the kind of species we want to become. These decisions will affect not just us, but potentially countless future generations who will inherit the world we create. So, here's the question I want to leave you with. If someone offered you digital immortality today, would you take it? Not in 50 years when the technology is perfected, but right now, with all the uncertainties and risks we've discussed. Would you trust Silicon Valley billionaires with your consciousness? Would you want to live forever in a digital world designed by people who see death as a bug to be fixed rather than a natural part of life? And maybe even more importantly, should we, as a society, allow this technology to be developed without our input? Should the future of human consciousness be decided by whoever has the most money and technical expertise? Or should it be a democratic decision made by all of us together? The digital immortality industry wants you to believe that this is inevitable, that resistance is futile, that you should just accept whatever technological future they're building. But nothing about this is inevitable. We still have time to shape how these technologies develop, to ensure they serve human flourishing rather than corporate profits, to preserve human dignity in the face of technological change. The conversation about digital immortality isn't really about technology at all. It's about what we value most about being human, what kind of future we want to create, and whether we're willing to fight for it. Your voice matters in this debate because ultimately, this is about all of us. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and make sure to share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really at stake in the race for digital immortality, because the future of human consciousness might depend on how many people are paying attention.